Let me say good evening again to all our participants. We're delighted that you could join us and Pat Thane today. I'm Gordon Lishman, I'm Treasurer of the Social Liberal Forum. Just before I turn to Pat and the main event tonight, I do want to say a word which will strike home, I know, with many people here, and indeed many of the people I've been exchanging correspondence with today. My oldest friend, Tony Greaves, died this morning at his house in Winewall, near Cone, about only 5 or 6 miles from where I am now. It was sudden. He had a heart attack. After people recognise this rather grumpily, saying that he didn't want to go to A&E just yet, but would do the Times crossword first. I've told people, and I think the word is now spread around the party, that we have lost Tony. But in my life and in the life of many of us in the Liberal Party and in recent years in the Liberal Democrats, not least in the Lords, Tony has had a leading, influential and very important role, and we shall miss him very much indeed. I won't do a minute's silence or anything like that, because I can hear Tony's voice in the background in full bar humbug mode at the suggestion of such a thought. Let me now turn, however, to this evening's event. The SLF is a campaigning organisation which has very strong views about our party and our country. But we also, to some extent, have the conscience and history of our party on our minds. We like to see that in context, and I very much hope that I have no reason to believe that Pat will pull any punches. What we need to have is a clear understanding of our history, where it comes from, and what is and isn't relevant for the future. Dr. Pat Thane has been a Professor of Contemporary History in London. In fact, I know her best for a book which has been on my shelves now for nearly 20 years, which I find, indeed, as I look, Old Age in English History. And in that, Pat takes a much longer term view, which looks back at the long history of aging and older people in ways which have important insights for us in the future. But Pat is talking tonight particularly about Beveridge and the context of the Beveridge Report, which actually, it hadn't occurred to me, but I've been doing some writing and I thought I would just hold up an original copy of the report, which, if you can see it clearly, cost me not the 10 shillings it says on the front, but 10 shillings, which may give you an idea of how long I've had it and how long it's been on my shelves. Patty is going to talk about the history, about where the Beveridge Report came from and what happened to it. But she is also, she goes through, going to give us some thoughts and ideas about what in that report is relevant for us today and what we need to know and understand today in looking at our future challenges. If you have any questions for the question session, please put them in the Q&A. You can find the button at the bottom of your screen and you will be able to put your questions in there, and we will come to you. We will come to you and deal with the questions. Sorry, I was losing my thread a little because I was looking at a few of the comments that you've kindly made about Tony in the chat and in the Q&A. Let's move on from that. Let's move to the business of this evening. And Pat, can I invite you to deliver your thoughts?
Right, well, thanks very much, Gordon, and thanks all of you for watching and listening. I was asked to discuss the proposals in Beveridge's famous wartime report of 1942 and their origins and effects as an introduction to our exploring whether he can guide us to possible solutions to the current crisis of severe, excessive poverty and inequality. So my talk will focus on him and his report. Beveridge was closely involved with UK social policy from the beginning of the 20th century, when he was based at the Toynbee Hall settlement in East London and engaged in voluntary work in East London. He remained strongly committed to voluntary action by the better off to help the disadvantaged as an essential component of a good, cohesive society, something essentially complementary to state welfare. He was also committed to ending unemployment and underemployment, the inability to get full-time work and pay, which he saw as a major cause of poverty at the time. And this is hugely relevant to now because the major poverty surveys before COVID by the Rowntree Trust and the Institute of Fiscal Studies also showed that effectively underemployment, what we now call the gig economy, the fact that people can't get good full-time work at decent pay, is the major cause of poverty. Most households in poverty, that's the main cause. So we do have that much in common with Beveridge. And he published a book about unemployment in 1909. We're on to slide 4 now, I think, Richard. In 1908, he was appointed advisor on unemployment to Winston Churchill, who was then a Liberal and president of the Board of Trade. And Beveridge was responsible for introducing labour exchanges in 1909, now called job centres, but rather less helpful to people, designed to help unemployed people find work. In 1911, he was behind the introduction of unemployment insurance, which was the first scheme of its kind in the world. During World War I, he advised the government on labour market issues and devised the improved unemployment benefit scheme introduced after the war. Between the wars, he remained active on social policy, especially concerning unemployment, while he was director of the LSE. In the next war, he was appointed advisor to Ernest Bevin, Minister of Labour, Labour MP, former trade union official, to advise on planning the wartime labour market. But Beveridge bombarded Bevin with unwanted advice and criticism, which was behaviour of which he had a bad reputation. And to get rid of him, Bevin had him appointed to chair a committee set up by the government to propose reform of social insurance. It was appointed because of growing criticism, including Beveridge, that old age pensions, national health and unemployment insurance, and other benefits that had developed since the beginning of the century were too diverse and coordinated. And early in the war, it became obvious they were failing to prevent severe poverty. Surveys revealed destitution among old people because the old age pension, introduced in 1908, had never provided enough to live on. And in fact, the British state pension has never, to now, provided enough to live on. Also, evacuation in the war revealed the deprivation of many urban children. So the committee was intended to propose ways to improve the system to reduce poverty, but it wasn't considered very important by the government and had very vague terms of reference. Beveridge was disappointed by this appointment because it seemed so unimportant. But then he became convinced he could do something important with it. The other committee members were civil servants who were too overworked to give it much attention. So Beveridge took over, and the report that came out in 1942 was his work. In this report, he proposed a comprehensive programme of state action to abolish want, as he called it. He never referred to poverty, I think, always to want, and the associated social problems. He put it dramatically in his report, writing that Britain needed an attack upon want. But want is only one of 5 giants obstructing the road to comprehensive social improvement. The others are disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. He always used vivid, dramatic language to draw attention to his ideas and worked hard to promote them, including on the BBC and in newspaper articles. He proposed that the 5 giants could be destroyed by introducing a national health service to cure disease, universal good education, good affordable housing to abolish squalor, full employment with decent pay to end idleness, improved social security benefits, and a family allowance for all children, to provide a safety net, as he put it, protecting people from destitution from the cradle to the grave, a kind of universal basic income. He proclaimed all this, but he was only appointed to reform the social insurance system. So the detailed proposals in the report only concern this, not the health service and other necessities, which are outside his brief. But he made it clear that on its own, social insurance reform wasn't enough. And to eliminate poverty, the state had to find ways to implement the other essential measures. And these were covered by other wartime investigations and proposals. So he proposed in his report a unified system, a universal system of national insurance, providing old age and widows' pensions, unemployment, sickness, disability, maternity, and other benefits for the whole working population in all classes, not restricted to manual workers like previous systems, and also covering the non-working wives of male contributors, be funded by contributions from workers, their employers, and the state. He believed very strongly that if everyone contributed to their benefits, these would be regarded as a right that they paid for, and receiving benefits would no longer be a source of stigma. Claimants would no longer be regarded as feckless dependents on hard-working taxpayers. This was an attitude that was common then, as it still is, and it was one Beveridge was determined to eliminate. He believed most poverty was involuntary and people should not be stigmatized because of it. He believed if better off people also received insurance benefits, they'd stop resenting paying taxes to help the poor, and the system would promote social cohesion. He also believed strongly the benefits should be enough to cover all essential needs for food, housing, clothing, fuel, everything, providing enough to live on. But not more than that. If people wanted a more comfortable life, he believed they should save for it, ideally through non-profit savings organisations like friendly societies. He insisted benefits should be flat rate, with flat rate contributions, not income related, as with the German and other insurance schemes. Again, because he believed they should cover subsistence and not more. Married women who weren't in paid work would receive benefits by virtue of their husband's contributions. And he believed they should receive these by right, describing them not as dependents of their husbands, but as partners. Because, he wrote, they must be regarded as occupied on work which is vital though unpaid, without which their husbands couldn't do their paid work, without which the nation couldn't continue. Views that echoed those of Eleanor Rathbone, a feminist independent MP, a friend of Beveridge, and many women's organisations at the time, who believed that women's work in the home should be treated as work, just like paid work, because it was equally essential to society and the economy. Beveridge didn't, as some critics suggest, believe married women should stay at home as dependents of their husbands in a male breadwinner welfare state. He recognised realistically that most married women had no choice because the marriage bar, as it was known, forced them to give up work on marriage in very many occupations. Others were prevented by the difficulties combining work inside and outside the home and lack of affordable childcare. The marriage bar mostly died out during the war. This wasn't obvious by 1942. And Beveridge offered a realistic proposal in this situation. He also proposed insurance allowances for divorced and separated wives and cohabiting unmarried wives, as they were known, paid for by the contributions of partners and ex-partners, and universal state-funded family allowances and funeral allowances. He also proposed old age pensions should be paid strictly on condition of retirement from paid work from age 65 for men and 60 for women, with higher payments for each year work beyond the minimum age, effectively introducing a flexible retirement age. The aim of this was to encourage older people to keep working, which was a result of another of Beveridge's concerns at the time, the ageing of society. The birth rate had been falling since the 1870s and life expectancy rising. And in the 1920s and 30s, there was a national panic about the ageing of society and the costs for a shrinking younger workforce of supporting a growing older population, things that sound very familiar today. And Beveridge and Keynes both contributed to the pre-war debate, proposing, among other things, that where possible, older people should work longer, if they could, to reduce the burden on younger people. And these concerns were another reason for Beveridge's support for family allowances, the hope that encourage families to have more children. In fact, the birth rate rose again from 1942, leading to the post-war baby boom, but this wasn't obvious when Beveridge wrote the report. He also proposed a new means-tested system, national assistance, to replace the ancient poor law at last and provide for people who slipped through the net of social insurance and needed help. People who couldn't pay contributions, like disabled people or unmarried mothers who were young and hadn't accumulated contributions, who benefited from the scheme. He hoped, though, that the rest of his proposed system would be so comprehensive that very few people would need this means-tested fallback system. He was strongly opposed to means testing because it was stigmatizing. It was costly to carry out the means tests and highly inefficient because in all known systems, many people in need failed to apply because of stigma or ignorance of eligibility. And this is still true of means-tested benefits internationally, or up to a third of eligible people may be in poverty, but they don't apply. He just proposes an unavoidable fallback for a minority of people. Well, his report, when it was published, immediately grabbed the headlines, partly because Beveridge worked very hard to promote it on the BBC, in the press and elsewhere. People queued up to buy it, and within a month, over 100,000 copies were sold. It'd be interesting to know how many people actually read the 299-page, very dense report. It's not the world's easiest read. The government's propaganda machine, the Ministry of Information, promoted it because they believed it would raise wartime morale by promising better lives after the war. It had never been intended to reform the social security system till after the war, and Beveridge wrote his report on this assumption. But Beveridge wasn't enthused and tried to stop a summary of the report being circulated to the armed services, but he had to give in because it was so popular, though he never supported Beveridge's proposals. He hoped the report be quietly shelved. In February 1943, backbenchers won the largest anti-government vote of the war for a commitment to implementing it. Labour strongly supported it, and the popularity of the report was a reason for their victory in the 1945 general election. Though in that election, Beveridge himself failed to be elected as a Liberal MP, partly because he was going around the country promoting his ideas and the party. But when Labour was in government, it didn't fully implement Beveridge's proposals. Committed as they were to developing state welfare, they believed that reconstructing the economy came first. Like Beveridge, they believed that full employment and a successful economy were the real key to improving living standards. This had been the Labour Party's belief since its foundation. And after 1945, they achieved economic growth and full employment, lasting till the 1970s. They introduced the National Health Service and other welfare measures, but they delayed full implementation of their welfare policies until the economy fully revived, hoping to remain in government long enough to fulfill their welfare plans. But they narrowly lost the 1951 election to the Conservatives, and this was not to be. So the outcome was a less comprehensive welfare state than Labour and Beveridge hoped. The NHS was a massive gain for the many working class people who'd not previously had free access to good health care, but no new hospitals were built or new schools. Benefits, especially pensions, were not paid at the full subsistence level that Beveridge proposed. This is partly due to miscalculation of post-war prices, but also because Beveridge proposed a new scheme should be introduced gradually over 20 years, so that insurance contribution would build up into a fund to cover the costs. Labour insisted on implementing it immediately because it was popular with voters, but they could only afford lower benefits. So within a few years, 1 million pensioners needed means-tested supplements from the National Assistance Board because they couldn't live on the pension. As I've said, never since has the UK state pension provided enough to live on without a means-tested supplement. This wasn't what Beveridge intended, and he was very sorry about it. Also, family allowances, which from 1946 were paid to all but the first child in every family, and had been intended by Beveridge to eliminate poverty in large families, were paid at a lower level he proposed and didn't eliminate child poverty. Nor was the proposal to encourage later retirement fully implemented. Those who stayed at work past the fixed retirement age received higher pensions, but the increase was very small. But had his scheme been fully implemented, it would have made recent attempts to raise retirement ages much easier. And no allowances were paid to divorced, separated, or unmarried wives, following protests that this would just encourage immorality. Beveridge wasn't consulted about implementation of his proposals, to his great annoyance. He was disappointed not to be involved in government planning to implement proposals, especially for full employment. So he pursued his key objectives after publication of the report. In 1943, when the wartime government was supposedly discussing full employment as an objective and produced a rather limited white paper, but he formed a committee of economists to explore means of achieving full employment. And a report published in 1944 as Full Employment in a Free Society recommended state investment in key industries, especially transport and power, increased state spending on essential services, including roads, hospitals, schools, and defence, state subsidies to housing, medical services, food and fuel, state regulation of private investment and consumer demand through control of interest rates, taxes and income distribution, and planned location of industry and labour mobility. This spurred the wartime government to rush out the publication of their full employment white paper with much more limited proposals. But many proposals were implemented by the Labour government, and they're aspiring to do even more if they'd remained in office. But they did do a great deal to revive the economy, achieve faster growth, and achieve full employment for the first time in peacetime. Then in 1948, Beveridge published Voluntary Action, pursuing another of his long-term goals, advocating the importance of voluntary action in a welfare state as a means of supplementing state welfare and encouraging social cohesion, of the support of the poor by the better off. So I don't have time to say any more about this, but I hope I've conveyed something of Beveridge's proposals and responses to them, and we can discuss whether they offer any guide for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. And that certainly takes us into some challenging debates. Can I start us off by perhaps asking you just how far some of the circumstances and the principles you're talking about apply now? I mean, firstly, very clearly, and Beveridge said so in the report, it arose from the circumstances of the time, not just war, but a period where there was a strong sense of the collective, particularly at work, but also in neighbourhoods and locally. All the great Bethnal Green stuff, of course, and Michael Young and others talking about a collective identity. Is it possible to build the support for a comprehensive package which, at the cost of everyone in society, provides a reasonable income and reasonable support for the poorest, in a society which doesn't have that sense of shared vulnerability to chance or accidents?
Well, obviously it's hard to know, but I feel pessimistic that there isn't that shared sense of concern about social conditions, about poverty, and about the need to hold together and improve the whole of society. I mean, it was there in 1945 because the war had gone on for 6 years, and also there'd been major poverty beforehand, and all these proposals were put forward. And Beveridge was very explicit about the importance of people holding together. But I do doubt that it's true. And there's been a recent survey by King's College showing that really quite a high proportion of people are still blaming the people using food banks for their own poverty. When it's perfectly plain from the really major surveys by respectable bodies like the IFS and Roundtree Resolution Foundation, even before the pandemic, how much severe poverty there is, and homelessness and use of food banks. And it's not people's fault. And of course, COVID's made it worse. And it should be obvious that the effects of COVID are not the fault of many of the victims. So I'm afraid I am pessimistic. The other difference, of course, is that there was a Labour Party and a Labour government strongly committed to change in the economy and in social welfare. And I don't feel that, I mean, sadly, as a member of the Labour Party, I don't feel the Labour Party has this. Not if it has, it's not very obvious it's got that commitment. And I certainly don't trust the Conservatives to have it. So I'm pessimistic, but no, we'll have to see what other people think.
I think others of us, particularly in the Social Liberal Forum, might share a lot of that view. Just to say to people listening, if they're interested, I have recently circulated to colleagues on the council a copy of a couple of background reports, one of which is the King's report that you mentioned, Pat. The other, I think, was the most recent Joseph Rowntree Foundation study of poverty in the UK. So if people want to see that, just if they either of those, if they get in touch with the SLF, we can provide them with copies of those because we've already done it. You made a reference, Pat, to comparisons with the German system in terms of more graduated payments, potentially to some extent linked to more graduated contributions. I'm seeing in some European academic circles at the moment some debate as to whether the German system specifically, but some of the continental systems, have worked well or worked better and more popular in those countries than essentially flat rate systems in our country. And I think that may be one of the big questions for the future, and about how far we relate contributions to payments out and so on. Do you have a view on that?
I think that's probably true, that an earnings relating system probably would have much wider support. And of course, Richard Titmuss and his colleagues at LSE did draft such a scheme for the Labour government Labour Party in 1957, which they didn't get around to implementing until the late 1970s, the state earnings related pension system. But of course, they no longer introduced it, and Thatcher closed it down. But I think there would be a strong case for that it would make it. It would mean that, state pensions really are so pathetic that to anyone on a decent income that has got an occupational pension, which of course the Tories started to encourage in the 1950s, then the state pension is just insignificant. Whereas if state benefits were of more value to people, then they'd be more likely to want to keep them going and improve them. And that would particularly help poorer people, but it would help everybody.
It raises an interesting longer-term question as well, which I was personally involved in for quite a time, which is this question of delay and whether or not you pay at a future level or at the long-term level from the beginning. And I recall, not personally, but I recall reading that one of Keynes' reactions to the Beveridge report was to say, can you guarantee this will not cost more than £100 million a year until inflation overtakes it?
Yeah.
And what that has meant, and what the 2006 reforms, the 2006 white paper reforms and the later legislation also did, was to create a system for the future, but not to address immediate short-term and extreme poverty amongst those who were the oldest people. And that principle seems to have continued right back to the debates of 1948. Should we not be thinking about ways in which we attempt to meet all forms of poverty now, rather than trying simply to create systems which may at some point in the future, if all goes well and nothing is reversed, turn out to be an improvement? Bit of a rhetorical question, that one, actually, I think. I'm sorry, you looked...
Keynes was worried about the cost. Oh. He was responsible for the proposal. Sorry?
I'm sorry,
Keynes was responsible for...
One of us froze there, and I can't tell whether people will have missed some of what you were saying or only I did. But never mind. Let's continue. Let me just ask you. Yeah, sorry. I've just had a text saying Pat froze. So can you go back to your last answer and what you were saying? Because I don't think anybody else, I don't think any of us managed to hear it. That was about whether you put off benefits for the future at the time when you made changes.
Yes, sorry, you keep freezing a bit for me.
Oh dear.
Well, there's trouble with technology. It was Keynes who proposed to Beveridge that the systems should be introduced gradually over 20 years so it could build up a fund so that it wouldn't be a huge pressure on the taxpayer from the beginning. But then Labour, precisely because of this problem that people were in real need, wanted to pay it immediately. So they did, but the benefits were lower. So I think there is a real problem that you need to do both, that you perhaps need something like a universal basic income to get people over the immediate problems while you introduce a longer term system which will keep people, in need at a decent income level in all circumstances. So I think you do need to combine them.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you now one of the questions from the Q&A. I can't bring in the person to ask it because it is an anonymous attendee, so I will just read it out. But Richard, when we have done that and when Pat has answered it, can we move to the question from Catherine, please, and then she can ask the question herself. The question from our anonymous colleague is one indeed which the Social Liberal Forum has been addressing in the last week or two. It's a sort of life, the universe and everything question. How do you factor into the equation the other great global challenges? Climate change, extinctions, artificial intelligence, and the fundamental change in the nature of work, the fundamental change in the nature of the family. And how do you exploit what Shafiq calls the architecture of opportunity? I don't know if you know that phrase, but she has just been promoting that, I think, as part of her recent book. Well, I don't recognize the phrase, but how far do you try and bring everything into this debate, and can that be the enemy of getting the individual components right?
Well, I think all like Beveridge do have to think about all of the important issues. And I'm not sure what's quite meant by the fundamental change in the nature of work, but what clearly has been happening to work in this country, particularly over the last 10 years, is the emergence of the gig economy. The number of people who are on 0 hours contracts, only self-employment, or paid less than minimum wage in thoroughly precarious situations, which a government properly controlling the labour market really could prevent. So this government is making no effort to prevent it. And it's been pointed out time and again by Matthew Taylor particularly, and he recently had the job of being in charge of labour control, whatever it was, the government, but that recently came to an end. And he says the government has got no plans to do anything to control the gig economy. And that was a major cause of poverty. And I'm really worried that when we go back after COVID, there'll be even more of it unless it's controlled. And similarly, another major cause of poverty is high housing costs, which is causing homelessness and just poverty among people having to pay high rents. And so unless more affordable housing is built, and I would say go back to rent controls, which we had from 1915 to the 1980s, and Germany has, and many other West European countries have, very effectively. Well, we need changes like that. Again, I'm not quite sure what's meant by changes in the family, because a lot of kind of mythology about this. I'm not very persuaded.
I'm sorry, you appear to have frozen again, Pat.
But I'm happy to discuss it if you. Yeah, there's nothing we can do about it.
I'm sorry, the bit we missed from what you were just saying started from your comment, which I must say I rather shared, on the fundamental quote, the fundamental change in the nature of the family. And you were saying you didn't quite know what that meant, but I think we then lost the next sentence or two.
don't remember what I said exactly. I certainly said there's a trade now in the past, but many people stay together for a long time, and there are lots of really functioning families. And intergenerational support is really quite strong.
I shall step aside from the possibility of addressing intergenerational issues. Having done enough of that recently in different fora, and I've now been having an argument with David Willets about this for 15 years, and I'm not sure that we have advanced the debate much further as part of that. Can we turn to Catherine and your question, which I know is one that you and I have discussed in the past. Do you want to put your question? I think you're muted, Catherine.
Yeah, I'm mute.
Hello.
Hello.
Pat, nice to see you in the flesh after all this time. I'm interested in what you answered to Gordon's suggestion that perhaps collective identity isn't strong enough now to produce the comments, the results that we want. But my own feeling has been that with COVID-19, there has been a strong resurgence of feeling for each other, a great deal of sympathy for other people, and a total end to the Brexit divide that we had. You know, the families divided everybody against each other. Instead, there had been a great deal of cohesive feeling, I think. And also, I think to my mind, this is caused also by the increase in unemployment, because people are no longer contemptuous about universal income, or rather universal credit, because they're having to apply for it. And therefore, a great many more people are doing that than used to do so. So I feel that with that, and with increasing unemployment and the difficulties of Brexit in particular, there may well be a great deal more sympathy for this kind of reforms that you and I think are necessary. I wonder what you think of that, please.
I think, I was very cheered by the amount of community action there was, particularly in the first lockdown. I also suspect that was just bringing into the open the kind of communal action that's long gone on. I think people hugely underestimate the importance of voluntary action in our culture. It's very much stronger, again, than the mythology has it. It's particularly strong among retired people, and amongst people who have got spare time to support other people with, and more people had spare time, of course, during the lockdown. But I still feel that it isn't extensive enough to really make a change. And we've got the other great disadvantage they didn't have in the 1940s, of the press and the social media winding people up to be nasty about poor and unemployed people. I don't think that's going to go away. So there probably are more people who are aware of social problems and concerned about them, but I suspect not enough, and not in influential enough places, and they are weighed by a lot of opposite thinking, but I'd like to be wrong.
I don't know if you saw Professor Marmot's piece in The Observer, in which he said that we need increased welfare benefits, partly to deal with the increasing problems of mental health that are arising from the isolation and the difficulties and the sadnesses of COVID-19.
No, I didn't see that piece, but I do know Marmot's work, and I have huge respect for it. And he's showing very clearly just how bad things are. He did that 10 years ago, and he's showing how it's got even worse now in his latest report, which I've read.
Indeed. Thank you.
But you know, there have been reports, but I like the report by the UN rapporteur, special rapporteur on extreme poverty, which was excoriating about the situation here. And the government just brushed it aside. And it really got less publicity and had less impact than it deserved, because it's it really describes all too clearly the devastating situation in late 2018, before COVID. So that's why I do get quite worried.
Sorry, I needed to unmute myself. I was just saying, Pat, I had in front of me, because I've been doing some work on this, my copy of, no less, Full Employment in a Free Society. And Beveridge, Beveridge actually credits his wife with coming up with the quotation there. Misery generates hate. And one of the things in our society is that those feelings of perhaps a lack of responsibility for poor people may be moving even further towards a feeling of dislike. I mean, here and in the United States, even more, you see the creation of walls, the separation of communities, the increasing growth of divided societies. And that is something which enables the richer to demonize the poorer. And it may be, in some ways, even worse amongst what Keynes called the educated bourgeoisie. I mean, this is a Lancastrian's challenge to, at least now, a Londoner. But I hear educated people from London, often academics, talking about poorer people with prejudices not necessarily their own in the north of England as people who are to be looked down upon, are not to be given or allowed a voice, because if they have that voice, they might use it to decide the wrong things. And I feel those divisions, if anything, becoming greater. Catherine, who just spoke, might have an even more direct experience because she lives in West Cumberland, where there are also those things. But is there that sense of division? I know you've been writing about what you call not a disunited, is it a disunited kingdom?
Divided kingdom.
A divided kingdom, yes, that idea. Yeah. Is there a geographical divide there which affects attitudes towards these things?
Well, I don't know. I mean, are there not people in the north, posh people, who are nasty about poor people? I mean, I don't. I mean, I don't. I mean, obviously, I must live in a kind of liberal-minded bubble here in North London, surrounded by highly educated people. But I don't hear speaking in that kind of way. And they are the sort of people who are involved in community action of various sorts. And they're very well aware that London actually has some of the worst poverty in the country.
Yeah.
It's got the highest level of child poverty in England. It's even worse in Glasgow. I mean, parts of East London really do have some most severe poverty among ethnic groups and just poor people of all kinds. So I rather dislike this London against the rest notion, but that may be just the sort of people that if I lived in Kensington, I might feel different, but in Camden.
Yes,
I
well,
just simply don't think people like that.
in my London days, I lived in Pimlico for over a decade, which may be at least as bad. Can we now go to Joy's question? I'm not sure, Joy, whether you're winder or winder, but can we ask your question?
Yes, I'd like to ask you if every our discussion today, what would he think about the Lib Dem our proposal commitment to universal basic income, and what do you think about it as well, please?
Well, I think it may well be a necessary first step to help the people in real need, while, as we said earlier, we're developing more sophisticated, complicated earnings-related national insurance systems. But I do think we need something urgent that really will help the people who are in immense poverty at the moment, all those people who are using food banks, something that gives them enough of an income to feed themselves, pay their rent, pay for all their essentials. And the universal basic income seems to me the only way that you'll get it to everyone who needs it. Because, as I said in the talk, all means-tested systems, about a third of eligible people don't apply. Either they don't know about it, or they just don't want the stigma of being means-tested. And a universal basic income, I mean, obviously, the people who don't need it will have it taxed, and the people who need it will get it. Again, I'm not optimistic it's actually going to happen, but I do think it would be the best immediate way out of the really serious poverty crisis that we've got.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pat.
I hope that's helpful.
Did you want to come back, Joy?
If I may, my interpretation of it, Pat, as a Lib Dem forever, is that it would benefit all of us. The universal is so important, a bit like from you know, and I don't mind being taxed on it at all, but it goes out to everybody. I mean, I don't know figures. I'm hopeless at figures, but something like 2,000 a year or something, you know, or maybe more, but that actually, and that would reduce the need for some means-tested benefits. So it would be a saving to the government, as well as something that can be done through the tax system.
Yeah. Mm.
So I think one
I'd like to see a calculation of the finances.
I mean, this is very much
because
the
the
challenge.
Universal credit is a disaster, very expensive.
Yeah. Do you think universal credit was a disaster in itself, in its design, or really is it the meanness and the bureaucracy which has surrounded its introduction that has created the problem?
Well, it's a mixture of both, I think. I mean, the design was bad because cramming together all those benefits when people really do have quite complex needs. And, you know, if one part of their life goes wrong, they shouldn't have to have everything else recalculated.
Yeah.
And it was a mean idea, and it was meanly administered.
Well, I remember when it was first mooted that the leading Labour Party spokesman on the subject at the time said that they were extremely pleased that the Conservative Party was introducing it because it was broadly the right answer, but he would like them to get the unpopularity associated with its introduction. And it's part of this continuing debate, isn't it?
Yeah.
The I mean, an interesting development of that is the idea, not in this context directly, but that our party leader introduced last weekend, which the SLF has promoted for a long time, which is about the use of sovereign wealth funds, and how a society can build up and use capital in ways that are useful to residents.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I was sorry, I was just I was just about to tell people, because I was going to make this announcement at the end, but I think Joy has just given us a means of doing this, which is to say that we are not going ahead with our event planned for very soon on the subject of UBI and the way forward. And the reason for that, I think, is very much the things we've been talking about, which is the difficulty of trying to find a coherent economic underpinning for it in terms of the way it would work. We are very much committed to making that debate happen. But we've got to have credible proposals, perhaps countervailing and different proposals, in order to do that. And we felt we haven't yet got to the stage with that debate where we can take that forward. So everybody, and I think there'll be quite a few of them on the line now, everybody who has registered for that, please note that you will get a note shortly saying that we're not able to take that forward. But I think we are just about to reach the end of our time. And just I'll ask you in a moment, Pat, if there's anything you'd like to say in summary. But before that, just to thank you very much for your contribution. We are looking at these things, trying to address them in terms of both history and contemporary society and contemporary politics. And you've made a very helpful contribution to our understanding, so that we can take that forward. Is there anything you'd like to add in summary?
No, I don't think so, but I'm happy to keep in discussion with you in the future. I wish the Labour Party was doing something like this, but it isn't. Yes. I'm obviously very interested in the issue. So I'm very happy to keep in touch about these things.
Thank you very much. And I hope we might even occasionally be able to do things with people in the Labour Party.
Yeah.
My former Age Concern colleague, Andy Harrop, who's done a great deal of work on these things, has been running the Fabian Society now for, I think, just under a decade. And very much he and I worked together very closely on a whole series of these things in his days at Age Concern. Although I would not, believe me, I would not for a moment claim to have Andy's intellectual grasp of almost everything. But I think involving that debate between us, involving the SLF and the Fabian Society and others, would be a very good way forward. And I think having that influenced and informed by history will be a very useful way of doing it. But thank you very much indeed, Pat. And thank you to everybody who's joined us.